What's up, everybody? This is a YEC Biblical Science lesson entitled Broken Rocks and Clocks. We're going to answer the question of whether or not rocks can be used to tell time. And the answer is, spoiler alert, they cannot. So don't go away. Make sure to share, like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. The link is in the top of the comment section. If you want to join the science lesson, I'll bring you in here with me. So don't go away. I will be with you shortly. In 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens deposited many fresh layers of dirt, rock, and ash around the volcano. 2 years later, a mud flow carved a mini Grand Canyon into the geologic strata that was laid down by the eruption. Multiple samples of the rock were taken from the canyon and sent to geochronological laboratories to be assigned an age, and every radiometric dating technique, was applied to these. It yielded a 100% failure rate for every rock that was tested. The youngest date for these rock samples were over 300,000 years old, and the oldest date was around 6 billion. But we know that the canyon is less than 100 years old. It's actually less than 50 years old. So every single one of these ages were incorrect. 100% failure rate. Would you imagine that? I'm going to play some videos on this canyon eruption for you.
A magnitude 5.1 earthquake causes the north face of the mountain to collapse, triggering the largest landslide in recorded history. Pressure rising from deep within the volcano rips open the mountainside, toppling entire forests, scorching everything in its path.
On this day, 42 years ago, Mount St. On this day, 42 years ago, Mount St. Helens erupted. A large magnitude 5 earthquake struck, which led to this landslide and ultimately led to the eruption of this volcano. The blast damage was swift and devastating. Mother Earth is beautiful, but there are natural hazards, and it's our jobs to learn how to live with them.
All of the dirt and rock that makes up the entirety of this little canyon next to Mount St. Helens was deposited by the eruption when all of the dust and ash fell back down to the ground, and much of that dust and ash was carried clear over near Kansas City, Missouri. Using the same methods called radiometric dating that they use to derive an age for diamonds to be about 6 billion years old, they have applied to the little canyon near Mount St. Helens, and the rock samples that were tested came back with the results of a minimum of 300,000 years old, when we know the rocks in the canyon are still not any older than even 50 years old. But despite the fact that we already know the ages of the rocks, the potassium-argon dates range from 350,000 to nearly 3 million years old. Another radiometric dating technique being used is carbon dating, whereas one part of a mammoth was dated at 29,000, another part was dated at 44,000. There's a glaring contradiction there. This living snail was dated at 23,000 years old. So what's going on with this? It's getting these wild dates that are 100% wrong. They actually use several radiometric dating techniques on those rocks, several samples from the canyon, and they all range from some 300,000 to even 3 billion. A lot of them were millions of years old. So how is that even possible when we know that the rocks were laid down recently? So their explanation is that the lava, because it's escaping the earth, it has to be trapped basically deep within the earth. And then it has to form, it has to slowly cool, form a solid structure, and then the uranium can then begin to decay into the lead. Because it's not in a molten state, it will then preserve that radioactive decay. So if it's recently introduced, like basalt, or the potassium argon, whatever the potassium gases are trapped in it, if that happened like a long time ago, when the rock was actually formed, like say millions of years ago, there was a volcanic eruption and then it suddenly cooled, trapping those gases. Well, then that was preserved by tons of sediment. Then you would be able to assume that, so much of the potassium has decayed into the argon over millions of years. But let me show you something here. You just take this model right here. You can take the model on the right, which is the mainstream view. The lower layers are older, the top layers are younger. Now, if you take a rock sample from any of those layers, you can apply them to all different kinds of radiometric dating techniques: potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium, uranium, lead, samarium, neodymium, all kinds of methods. And they will all come back with ages of 300,000 to 3 billion years old. It will range. That's the range that you're going to get from multiple tests. And so you have to account for things like contamination. Maybe there was a recent volcanic activity, and so, or that would affect the potassium and argon. You could, let's see. If you look at the lowest layers, they actually contain high levels of uranium. Have long-lived half-lives, so the decay of the element, they actually measure the elements based on their half-lives. So if it starts out with 100% uranium, then 50% will deplete. And when it depletes, when the atoms are lost, it actually, is turned into something lighter than itself. So uranium decays into lead. And we know that it decays over a consistent rate of time based on current measurements, based on its rate of decay today. So you take that measurement, you take that assumed rate of decay, which it isn't assumed, it's known, the rate at which it decays. So if you take that high level of uranium at the bottom, the half-life of it is a lot longer, because it takes a lot longer for uranium to decay into lead than it would for elements that are at the top, like potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium. They would yield deep time, ages, millions of years. It would be, within hundreds of thousands or millions. Whereas if you go to low layers, you will get much higher ages, because of the fact that it's taking longer for the uranium to decay into the lead. And so elements that are able to last that long will be preserved for longer, is the idea. Then there's the model on the left that you could also, if you didn't have a bias, if you weren't prejudiced, and if you were just not stuck, or committed to the mainstream view, and you think outside of the box, which according to the greatest historical document ever written, there was a global flood, which completely devastates the whole model of, modern geology and paleontology, which is the, Darwinian evolution is the principal philosophy behind it. But you take the model with an open mind on the left, you consider, that the most of the fossil record itself is even what you see here. What you see in the fossil record is everything that's at the bottom. It's like clams, basically, is most of the fossil record. Things with that backbone, non-vertebrates. And so, just like, relatively speaking, there's just a handful of these other fossils. They're just, misrepresented in a graph. This is the way that it looks on graph, but not realistically. Relatively speaking, the ones that are at the top, land dwelling, don't even exist. So anyways, you can go to the low layers, and you could say that was the pre-flood world, where the granite bedrock, which the pre-flood world stood upon. Now, you have a global flood, which completely uproots a lot of that and deposits it back onto the surface. And so mounds, mountains, modern mountains form. And so you have all this new geologic strata, which in the process of time, you can, in the global flood, the geophysics occurring here with 200-foot tidal waves and no continents to interrupt them, hydrologic sorting, liquefaction, basic principles. You can look at the hydroplate theory by Walt Brown, and even the catastrophic plate tectonics model. You can research that to explain how the geophysics of a flood sorted the layers and the fossils. The fossils based on their ecosystem, and then the layers based on those principles I mentioned: hydrologic sorting, liquefaction, lighter, denser particles on the bottom being uplifted through heavier particles which sink down lower, so it's established into layers as well. And so the point is that the fossils being in that order, that could have come from a flood burying the ecosystems. Basic ecosystem, you look at even today, the least complex organisms live in the bottom of the ocean floor, and then complexity rises as you increase altitude above sea level. So you have just a world that existed very similar to ours, but containing much more plants and animals. Most of them, which would be extinct today, existed before the flood, catastrophically buried. So why would you find longer-lived half-lives of radioactive elements at the bottom and lower-lived at the top? And the short answer to that is, and you can look at part 1 of the seminar, Fountains of the Great Deep, and I'm about to put together the playlist, but I'm doing part 5 on Wednesday night, so make sure you check that out. But part 1 of the seminar was the origin of Earth's radioactivity. You can go to Brian Nichols' YouTube channel. He has a presentation on that, which is based on the theory of hydroplate theory by Walt Brown. Read the book In the Beginning. I did a debate on this topic. You can visit the debate playlist. You can go to the beta seminars. You can go to the biblical science lesson playlist. And so find a lot more on this topic. But the model on the right is going to suggest that these measurements have been taken are accurate, which we know. I just showed you some examples, and I'll show the video again here in a minute. But these dates are completely wrong. You do have longer lived half-lives at the bottom, like uranium and lead are radioactive elements, potassium argon or rubidium strontium are radioactive elements, but they have some of them last longer than the others. So why is it that we have what would be, I guess, a problem for the global flood if those ages were true? Because in their view, the least complex organisms are evolving into the most complex at the top. And the radiometric data are supposed to be correlating with that. But there's actually no way that those dates can correlate with the order that the fossils are set in. There's no way that they can correlate that unless, you're assuming that they evolved in that order. So I'm going to play the video again and notice that these dates are completely wrong. You can only get a relative age. So you can know that, obviously the layers on the bottom were laid down first before the ones on the top. That doesn't necessarily mean it took millions of years, though. And you can know that there are high levels of radioactivity at the lowest layers and low levels at the top. But that still can't give you an age. It can tell you where you are in the strata. But, it could be that the high levels of radioactivity, radioactive elements themselves, were produced by the geophysics of the global flood. So make sure you go to part 1 of the Fountains of the Great Deep seminar. So let me play this video again.
All of the dirt and rock that makes up the entirety of this little canyon next to Mount St. Helens was deposited by the eruption when all of the dust and ash fell back down to the ground, and much of that dust and ash was carried clear over near Kansas City, Missouri. Using the same methods called radiometric dating that they use to derive an age for diamonds to be about 6 billion years old, they have applied to the little canyon near Mount St. Helens, and the rock samples that were tested came back with the results of a minimum of 300,000 years old, when we know the rocks in the canyon are still not any older than even 50 years old. But despite the fact that we already know the ages of the rocks, the potassium argon dates range from 350,000 to nearly 3 million years old. Another radiometric dating technique being used is carbon dating, whereas one part of a mammoth was dated at 29,000, another part was dated at 44,000. There's a glaring contradiction there. This living snail was dated at 23,000 years old.
So now let's discuss those carbon dates. Why would, a living snail date to be that old? It's it probably has to do with the chemistry of the snail or whatever. But the thing about carbon dating is that it's the half-life. You measure one half-life, 50% of it has depleted, and then you go 50% of that, 50%, I guess 25%, and then you just keep reducing that by halves until it's virtually, it's like you can't even measure it. And that maximum limit, total amount past lives, whatever that would be, is like 100,000 years total as a max for carbon dating. And so they would use it to date things that are like believed to be relatively recent, like ancient civilizations and stuff. They wouldn't, and then you could use it to date like a mammoth fossil. But even those ones, like I showed, one part of the mammoth, 29,000, part 44,000. So that's a pretty big difference just in that. And it makes the, whole theory suspicious. But then, you could date others like the little snail, and there's other examples, carbon dates being used, on dinosaur fossils, and they yield, like 100,000 years or something. And so they're supposed to be extinct 65 million years ago based on the radiometric dating techniques of the KT boundary, which is above the dinosaur fossils. They date that and say it's 65 million years old. But if you look at the carbon in the dinosaur fossils, it's a lot younger. It's just hundreds of thousands of years old. So why does that why is that problem? They would say that you do not date a dinosaur fossil with carbon dating because we know it can't last over 100,000 years. Well, then you have to explain why it's even in the dinosaur fossil. And the simplest explanation would be that the carbon that's in the dinosaur fossil had to have come recently, had to have been, intruded into the fossil from an outside, like from upper surrounding strata. Had to happen that way, like carried by water or something. And that's be the only way to explain it. So, it seems to me that if you don't know the age of a rock, you have no idea of the age, that these methods would work, But then as soon as you find out the age, like if you know the dinosaur is 65 million years old, well, then the method is assumed not to work. It's like saying that my calculator works, but it only works with big numbers. It's really illogical unless the mainstream view of paleontology and geology is accurate and the fossil record represents millions of years of evolution. If that were true, then their methods would be feasible. They would at least be, a credible forensic analysis of the situation, because, you do have billions of years down here and millions of years up here. There's an explanation like the global flood to explain that. But even if that were true, I guess you could, that'd be legitimate if paleontology, like if evolution took place. So you have two fields of research here, okay, supporting one another in order to make a collective case. It's not just one or the other, because if you look at geochronology in itself, it cannot show that the Earth is millions of years old just based on the dates, because the dates go all over the place. And when they're used to date rocks of known age, like dinosaur fossil or rocks from the Mount St. Helens Canyon, they're 100% wrong. So you have to have, in order to know the age of a rock, you have to have what is known as the index fossil. So it's a particular kind of creature, like a ocean dwelling creature, shoreline creature, reptile creature, mammal creature, and that will tell you your position. So you already have to know the age of the rock in order for these methods to work. It's based on a model. Now it does fit what is relatively there actually in the fossil record based on a fact. High levels of radioactivity down here, low levels up here. But I would say that the only reason that the mainstream view is what's being taught, in the schools, universities, even National Geographic and Discovery Channel. It's just based on a market. It's a competing market out there, and there's no room for creation in it because they've been dominating the market ever since they began to take over the school system. So it's really just money and politics and the control of the media. It's propagating these millions of years, when if you actually examine, they don't really stand up to close scrutiny. I mean, we could get into some other stuff, I suppose, but I think I will just suffice to say that if you trust radiometric dating, you cannot trust it just with, in itself. You cannot trust those ages, because if you date rocks of known age, it can't work. You have to, have something like a standard to look at your radiometric dates, because you're going to take a sample, okay, and send it to multiple geochronological laboratories. And they're going to give you like if they date it with potassium argon, you will have a range of dates to select from, because one sample will have like, you're factoring in like contamination, and you're, because if the potassium is decaying into the argon, has it always decayed at the same rate? Is all of the argon from the potassium? Simple assumptions like that, which they factor into the equations, which is why they get basically a list of a bunch of results from multiple techniques that they use. And so those are selected results. Okay, they're selected based on the geologic column, based on the fossil record. You can't just pick any one of them. You won't know which ones are from contaminations and which ones are not unless you have the geologic column. So let me bring that up one more time. You would not be able to tell, how old something is. You could tell if it was millions or billions of years old, but you could not get the range from 100,000 to 30 million to 500 million. You cannot get in that kind of a range and tell that these animals evolved based on those dates. You can't do it, because the dates are going to range all over the place. You're going to get multiple results, and you have to select the best ones. So maybe we'll discuss one more thing. You have what isochronic dating. The basic principle behind that is you use several techniques, several radiometric dating techniques, and you then you see if they fall on the same line. If potassium argon, you find a sample and it has potassium argon in it, and then you measure that and it comes to, say, 2 million years old. Okay, well then you should be able to use a sample of rock containing uranium and lead that's in the same strata or near the same strata, and it would come to, having a completely different rate of decay. It would actually, the age of that rock would actually line up with the potassium argon dates. And so you have two elements that decay at completely different rates, but when you measure them, they come up with the same age. And that would work. That actually happened in the laboratory, but it doesn't. Okay, you're going to have, if you date it with potassium argon, you have a sample, you're going to have multiple results of potassium argon, multiple results, at least 3 or 4 of uranium and lead, and you're going to have to select from those based on the geologic column. And so what the radiometric dating is just, it's a good forensic case if evolution actually happened, but if it didn't happen, then it's not a good case at all for anything. It's just a way to tell whether or not you're higher or lower in the strata. So that concludes this biblical science lesson. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure to stay in prayer. God bless America. My name is Christopher Silvius. God bless. Peace be upon you.